The terminal hummed with the sound of people moving through their routines, rollers of carry-on luggage clicking over tiled floors. The faint cadence of boarding announcements echoing in the background. The low murmur of conversations blending into the white noise of a busy airport. Amari Dawson adjusted the strap of her messenger bag as she stepped into the long line at the check-in counter. It wasn't her first time navigating this particular airport. She had done it many times. Enough to know which counters moved faster and which gates required a brisk jog to avoid missing a flight. Still, there was always something unnerving about the process handing over her belongings. Trusting that they would arrive safely at her destination. The system, she supposed, was built on trust. When her turn came, she greeted the agent with a polite smile. Her suitcase, a practical black carry-on she'd used for years, was placed on the scale. The agent, a young woman with a tired expression, tapped on the keyboard before pausing. "It's overweight," the agent said. Without looking up, Amari blinked. She had weighed the bag before leaving home. "That's surprising. I thought it was under the limit." The agent sighed, then turned the screen toward Amari. The number glared back at her. 26 pounds. Well within the limit. "I think there's a mistake," Amari said gently. The agent frowned, her gaze flickering briefly toward Amari before she straightened. "I'll have to call someone to confirm." Amari stepped aside to wait, trying not to let the irritation bubble up. She had an early flight. And this wasn't the start she had hoped for. She glanced around the terminal, noticing the efficiency with which other passengers' bags were being processed. No extra steps, no delays. After several minutes, a supervisor appeared. She was older, with a crisp uniform and a no-nonsense demeanor. The name tag on her chest read Evelyn Grace. "What seems to be the issue?" Evelyn asked. The agent explained in clipped tones. And Evelyn glanced at the screen before turning to Amari. "Your bag is fine," she said, but her tone was more dismissive than reassuring. "You can proceed to your gate." Amari hesitated. "I'd like to know why there was confusion in the first place." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her stance shifted slightly. "Mistakes happen," she said curtly. "It was a small thing. A hiccup in the system. The kind of inconvenience most people would shrug off." But the way Evelyn spoke, efficient, almost brusque, left Amari with the faintest hint of unease. She couldn't help but wonder if her presence, her identity, had played any role in the interaction. Amari didn't push further. She nodded and moved on, carrying the question with her as she made her way to security. The moment passed, swallowed up by the rhythm of the airport. Evelyn returned to her desk. The agent resumed her work, and the line behind Amari inched forward. But the memory lingered. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a remarkable event. No raised voices, no outright confrontation, just an interaction, one of countless others happening that day. Yet there was something unsettling about how easily it could be dismissed, a minor annoyance for one, a nagging question for another. Amari passed through security with little trouble. As she sat near her gate, watching planes taxi in the distance, she thought about how these moments accumulated over time. Each one, small and seemingly insignificant, added to a larger story. It wasn't that she expected perfection. Systems failed, people made mistakes, but sometimes, it felt as if the weight of those failures fell unevenly, landing harder on some than others. Her flight was called, and she stood, gathering her bag. The question remained unanswered. In the background, the terminal carried on, indifferent and steady, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The customer service counter was tucked into the corner of the terminal, a place designed for passengers with problems to quietly sort them out. The sign above it read, "Passenger Assistance," in clean, professional lettering, as though the words themselves could smooth over the frayed nerves of travelers in need. Amari approached the counter mid-morning, carrying a calm exterior despite the growing unease she felt. She had just received word that her luggage, her only checked bag, had been misplaced. The tracking app on her phone offered little more than a vague assurance, "in transit." That could mean anything. The line was short, but it moved slowly. A man in a business suit stood at the front, gesturing broadly as he explained his predicament to the agent behind the counter. Amari caught fragments of the conversation, something about a missed connection in a meeting in Chicago. The agent nodded sympathetically, her voice low and accommodating as she assured him they would do everything they could to help. When it was finally Amari's turn, she stepped forward, offering a polite, "Good morning," before explaining her situation. "My bag didn't make it onto my flight," she said, keeping her tone steady. "I've tried tracking it, but I'm not getting much information. Could you help me figure out where it is?" The agent, a young man with an air of practiced detachment, tapped at his keyboard. "What's your confirmation number?" Amari handed over her ticket. He entered the details, his fingers moving methodically across the keys. After a few moments, he frowned at the screen. "It looks like the bag is in the system," he said, "but I can't see its exact location." "Does that mean it's lost?" Amari asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not lost," he replied quickly, as if to avoid escalation. "It's just delayed. These things happen sometimes." She nodded, though the response did little to settle her concerns. "Is there someone who can give me more specific information? I have important items in that bag." The agent hesitated before glancing over his shoulder. One moment, he disappeared into a back office, leaving Amari standing alone at the counter. Minutes passed. Travelers filed by, some hurried and distracted, others ambling with time to spare. Amari shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her mind wandering to the items in her suitcase. It wasn't just clothes, there were documents for a presentation, a gift for her niece. Small things, but important nonetheless. When the agent returned, he was accompanied by a middle-aged woman in a tailored airline uniform. Her name tag identified her as Evelyn Grace, and her expression was one of polite detachment. "How can I help you?" Evelyn asked, her voice professional but lacking warmth. Amari repeated her explanation, this time adding more details. She had checked her bag well before the flight, followed all procedures, and now simply wanted to know where it was. Evelyn listened, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. When Amari finished, Evelyn nodded curtly. "Unfortunately, baggage delays are not uncommon. Our system shows that your bag is in transit, but we can't guarantee when it will arrive. Is there a way to prioritize it?" Amari asked, keeping her tone even. "That's not something we typically do," Evelyn replied. Her words were neutral, but her delivery carried a faint edge, an unspoken suggestion that Amari's request was unreasonable. Amari took a breath. "I understand delays happen, but I've seen other passengers in similar situations receive more assistance. I'd just like the same level of support." Evelyn's eyes flickered briefly, a quick and almost imperceptible shift, before she replied, "I assure you, we're doing everything we can." The conversation continued in the same restrained tone, each exchange polite but laden with unspoken tension. Amari wasn't shouting or demanding, and Evelyn wasn't openly dismissive. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a friction that neither acknowledged aloud. When it became clear that no further progress would be made, Amari thanked them both and walked away. She didn't feel angry, exactly, frustrated, perhaps, tired, certainly, but more than anything, she felt the weight of a familiar pattern. Small moments like these, layered one on top of the other, forming a quiet but undeniable mosaic. In Evelyn's office, the agent glanced at her hesitantly. "Should we escalate her case?" he asked. Evelyn shook her head. "She'll be fine. These things usually sort themselves out." Her voice was steady, but for a moment, she seemed to consider the words as she spoke them. Out in the terminal, Amari found a seat near a window. The day was clear, and she watched as planes taxied to and from the gates. Travelers came and went, their journeys continuing uninterrupted. Her own journey, it seemed, had hit a different kind of delay. Not just her luggage, but something more intangible, a sense of being stalled in a system that, no matter how efficient it claimed to be, still managed to leave people like her waiting. The airport gate area was a microcosm of life in motion, children chattering as their parents wrangled carry-ons. A young couple scrolling through their phones in unison. A businessman speaking too loudly on his Bluetooth. Amari sat among them, still and silent, her bag nestled at her feet, her thoughts spinning far faster than her outward composure suggested. She had left the customer service counter with nothing more than vague assurances and a reference number. It wasn't her first time navigating this sort of interaction. Though that familiarity didn't make it any easier. The feeling was always the same, a small, quiet frustration. The nagging sense that what she asked for wasn't unreasonable, yet was somehow treated as though it were. Nearby, a fellow traveler shifted in her seat. Lila Nguyen, a petite woman in her late 40s, had watched the exchange at the counter from a distance. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the tension had drawn her attention, like a ripple spreading across otherwise calm waters. Now, as the boarding announcement echoed over the PA, she caught herself glancing in Amari's direction. Amari noticed, meeting her gaze briefly before turning back to her phone. She wasn't in the mood to make conversation, especially not with a stranger. But Lila, after a moment's hesitation, stood and approached. "Excuse me," Lila said softly, her voice cautious but warm. "I couldn't help overhearing earlier. That sounded frustrating." Amari looked up, surprised. "It was," she admitted after a pause. "But I guess it's just one of those things." Lila nodded, sensing the undercurrent of resignation in Amari's tone. "I've seen how they handle these situations," she said, glancing toward the counter. "It doesn't always feel fair." Amari tilted her head, studying Lila. It wasn't an apology or even an offer to help, but there was something in her words that felt genuine. "You noticed that too?" she asked. "I did," Lila said. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more, then added, "You weren't wrong to ask for better treatment." Amari offered a faint smile, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her weariness. "Thanks. It's hard to tell sometimes. I don't want to be the one making a scene, but I also don't want to let things slide." "I get that," Lila said, sitting down in the seat next to her. "It's tricky. You want to believe people mean well, but sometimes it feels like the deck is stacked against you." Their conversation paused as a boarding announcement blared overhead. Amari listened absently, her mind returning to Evelyn Grace's clipped responses. The subtle indifference that had left her feeling so dismissed. It wasn't overt hostility, it never was. That, she thought, was what made it so insidious. "Do you think it would have been different if I were someone else?" Amari asked quietly, almost to herself. Lila didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. Around them, passengers began lining up to board, shuffling forward in orderly rows. The airline's efficiency was back on display, a seamless process that seemed to contradict the chaos Amari had experienced earlier. "I've traveled a lot," Lila said finally, her voice low, "and I've seen how people get treated differently. Not always on purpose, but it happens. People don't want to admit it, but it's there." Amari nodded slowly. "It's not even the big stuff," she said. "It's the little things. A tone of voice, a look, how quickly they move to help. You notice it, even if no one else does." Lila glanced at the crowd, at the faces moving past them without so much as a glance in their direction. "I noticed," she said. "For what it's worth." Amari looked at her, a mix of surprise and appreciation in her expression. "That does mean something," she said. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the line thinned and the gate agents prepared to close the door. It was a small moment, barely a blip in the grand scheme of things. But for Amari, it was enough to remind her that she wasn't imagining things, that someone else had seen it too. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to board, she thought about how rare it was for someone to step forward, even in such a small way. Most people, she realized, preferred to keep their heads down, not because they didn't care, but because it was easier that way. Lila returned to her own seat, pulling out a book as Amari joined the line to board. Their conversation lingered in the air, quiet and unfinished, like so many others that had come before it. And as the plane ascended into the clear blue sky, the world below carried on as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The office behind the customer service counter was small, sterile, and meticulously organized. The walls were painted a shade of beige that seemed designed to calm frazzled nerves. But it only amplified the underlying tension in the air. Evelyn Grace sat at her desk, her posture as precise as the rows of files neatly stacked on the shelves behind her. Her hands rested lightly on the keyboard as she typed out a report. Her face unreadable, The incident with Amari Dawson was already fading into the background of Evelyn's day. It wasn't that she didn't care. Exactly. She prided herself on being professional and efficient. Qualities that had earned her the title of supervisor after years of diligent work. But there was always another complaint to handle. Another irate passenger to pacify. And Evelyn had learned to compartmentalize. It was the only way to survive in a job where you bore the brunt of other people's frustrations. Still, something about Amari's case lingered. Maybe it was the way she had calmly but firmly pressed for answers. Her quiet determination cutting through the usual cacophony of emotions Evelyn faced at the counter. Or maybe it was the subtle shift in the atmosphere when Amari had walked away, a tension Evelyn couldn't quite name. As Evelyn reviewed the incident in her report, she caught herself hesitating. She was supposed to note the passenger's demeanor, the steps taken to resolve the issue, and the ultimate outcome. The words came easily, but they felt hollow. Passenger appeared calm but dissatisfied. She typed, her fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard. Provided tracking information and assured resolution pending further updates. She paused, staring at the screen. The words were accurate, but they didn't tell the whole story. They didn't capture the undercurrent of the exchange. The way Amari's questions had quietly challenged the system's inertia. Across the terminal, Amari sat at her gate, her phone resting in her hand as she debated whether to call the airline's corporate office. She had already submitted a formal complaint through the website, though she suspected it would be buried under a pile of similar grievances. She thought about Evelyn Grace, her clipped tone, her matter-of-fact responses, the way she had dismissed Amari's concerns without outright denying them. It was all so subtle, so carefully measured, that it would have been easy to let it go. But Amari couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about her missing bag. It was about the way she had been seen or not seen. The way her concerns had been minimized, treated as less urgent than the complaints of other passengers she had observed earlier. Back in the office, Evelyn's focus was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Daniel, a younger agent who often worked alongside her. "Got a minute?" he asked. Stepping inside, Evelyn nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" "It's about that passenger from earlier," Daniel said, his tone hesitant. "The one with the delayed bag. Dawson, I think her name was?" Evelyn folded her hands on the desk, her expression carefully neutral. "What about her?" Daniel shifted in his seat. I don't know if we handled that right. She seemed reasonable, but I feel like we didn't really try to help her. At least, not as much as we could have." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She had trained Daniel herself, and she appreciated his diligence. But she also knew he had a tendency to second-guess himself. "We followed protocol," she said evenly. "Her bag is being tracked. There's nothing more we can do until it arrives." "I know," Daniel said, but it felt different, like maybe we weren't listening to her the way we should have been. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver, but she felt a flicker of something, an unease she wasn't ready to name. "We treat all passengers the same," she said firmly. "Our job is to handle each case professionally and efficiently. And that's what we did." Daniel nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Right. Of course." As he left the office, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. She told herself that she had done everything by the book, that Amari's frustration wasn't her responsibility. But the flicker of unease remained. A small but persistent reminder that even the most carefully measured actions could leave something unresolved. Outside, the airport continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures. The world moved forward, steady and indifferent, while Evelyn and Amari sat in their separate corners, each turning over the same unspoken question. How much of this was just the way things were and how much of it could have been different? The coffee shop near the airport entrance was a haven of stillness compared to the chaos of the terminal. Amari sat at a small corner table, her phone resting beside a half-finished cup of tea. The email from the airline she had just received was polite but unhelpful. A boilerplate acknowledgement of her complaint with a promise to look into the matter. It wasn't surprising. She had expected as much. Yet the weight of the interaction lingered. Not because it was unusual, but because it wasn't. Amari had learned over time that these moments, the unanswered questions, The indifferent responses were part of a pattern. Small, quiet indignities that didn't shout for attention but left a mark nonetheless. Across the room, Lila Nguyen entered, her carry-on bag rolling lightly behind her. She noticed Amari almost immediately and hesitated for a moment before making her way over. "Mind if I join you?" Lila asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Amari nodded, offering a faint smile. "Sure." Lila sat down, setting her bag at her feet. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," she began, "about what you said, and what I saw." Amari raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. "I've traveled a lot," Lila continued, her tone reflective, "and I've seen things like that before. People getting brushed off, not taken seriously, but today, it just hit differently." "Why's that?" Amari asked, though she could guess the answer. "Because I could see it wasn't about your bag," Lila said quietly. "It was about something bigger than that. And I feel like I should have spoken up." Amari leaned back, considering her words. "It's not easy to step into someone else's fight," she said, "especially when it feels like no one else is paying attention. But someone should," Lila said firmly. "Someone needs to." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping nearby. A man in his early 40s with a slightly rumpled appearance and a laptop slung under his arm approached their table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but curious. "I couldn't help overhearing. Are you talking about the airline? A complaint?" Amari and Lila exchanged glances before Amari nodded cautiously. "Yes." "Why?" The man pulled out a business card and handed it to her. It read, "Michael Rhodes, freelance journalist. I cover stories about inequality," he explained, his voice calm and measured. "Corporate policies, systemic bias, things like that. If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear more about what happened." Amari studied him for a moment, unsure whether to trust his intentions. But something in his tone, genuine, unhurried, put her at ease. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sure, let's talk." As they recounted the events of the day, Michael listened without interrupting, his notepad open in front of him. He scribbled notes, asking occasional clarifying questions but otherwise letting Amari and Lila tell the story in their own words. "What struck me," Lila said at one point, "was how subtle it all was. No one said or did anything overtly wrong. But the way she was treated, it wasn't the same as how others were treated. And that's the problem, isn't it? No one has to say anything, they just act like you're less important. And that's enough." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That's often how it works. It's not about what's said, it's about what's left unsaid. About the choices people make without even realizing they're making them." Amari leaned forward, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "And when you call it out, they act like you're imagining it. Like you're being too sensitive. Or reading too much into things. But it's not just about today. It's about all the other times this has happened." Michael closed his notebook, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. And that's why stories like yours matter. They show people the patterns. The things they don't always see or think about." Amari sat back, her skepticism softening slightly. She wasn't sure if anything would come of this conversation. But it felt good to be heard, to have someone listen without dismissing her. As they wrapped up, Michael promised to stay in touch. And Lila exchanged numbers with Amari before heading off to catch her connecting flight. Left alone at the table, Amari sipped the last of her tea, the warmth settling in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time that day, she felt something close to hope. In the quiet corner of the coffee shop, with the hum of the airport fading into the background, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that this small act of being seen could ripple outward, creating a change she had almost stopped hoping for. The article appeared online early in the morning. Michael Rhodes had titled it, "Patterns of Dismissal: How Bias Shapes Everyday Experiences." It wasn't a sensational piece. It didn't need to be. Instead, it painted a careful, deliberate picture of Amari Dawson's experience, situating her story within a broader context of systemic inequality in customer service. He didn't accuse individuals or dramatize the incident. He simply laid out the facts, letting the details speak for themselves. The reaction, however, was anything but quiet. By midday, the story was trending on social media. Passengers from across the country began sharing their own stories of feeling ignored, dismissed, or devalued by the very systems meant to serve them. The comments section filled with a mix of empathy, anger, and denial. Some readers thanked Michael for shining a light on an issue they had experienced but struggled to articulate. Others questioned whether the story was being blown out of proportion. Amari, meanwhile, had only learned of the article when her phone buzzed with a flurry of notifications. Friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances were forwarding her the link, expressing their support or asking for details. She read the article in her small apartment, seated at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. The words felt both validating and exposing. Michael had captured her frustration, her sense of invisibility, with startling accuracy, yet seeing her experience laid bare for the world to dissect was unnerving. Later that afternoon, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Jack Carter, a public relations executive from the airline. "Ms. Dawson, this is Jack Carter with Northern Skies Airlines," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "I wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience you experienced and assure you that we take these matters very seriously." Amari listened silently, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She could hear the rehearsed professionalism in his tone, the careful phrasing designed to contain any fallout. "We've launched an internal review of our customer service policies," Jack continued, "and we'd like to offer you compensation for your trouble. A travel voucher for a future flight, as well as reimbursement for any expenses incurred during the delay." "That's generous," Amari said finally, her voice calm. "But I don't think this is just about me." Jack hesitated, caught off guard. "Of course, we understand that systemic issues need to be addressed, and we're committed to making meaningful changes." Amari didn't respond right away. She could hear the hum of the PR machine in his words. The carefully constructed language meant to deflect and reassure without committing to anything tangible. "I appreciate the gesture," she said after a moment. "But I'm not interested in a voucher. I'm interested in knowing what changes you're actually going to make." Jack faltered, the practiced rhythm of his pitch disrupted. "We're still in the process of reviewing our procedures. But I assure you, I'll wait for the results of the review." Amari interrupted, her voice steady. "And I hope this isn't just about putting out a fire." The call ended shortly after, leaving Amari with a sense of both empowerment and exhaustion. She had spoken up, but she wasn't naive enough to believe the issue would be resolved with one conversation. Meanwhile, Evelyn Grace sat in her office at the airport, staring at her computer screen. She had seen the article too, and her name had not been mentioned, though she recognized herself in the descriptions. The piece had unsettled her. Not because it painted her as a villain, it didn't, but because it forced her to confront questions she had avoided asking herself for years. Had she really treated Amari differently? Had she let implicit bias shape her decisions without realizing it? Evelyn prided herself on being fair, professional, and efficient, but as she read the comments under the article, she felt an uncomfortable truth pressing against the edges of her conscience. One comment stood out: "It's not about big gestures or outright discrimination. It's about the little ways people show you what they think you're worth." She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, staring at the beige walls of her office. The words stayed with her, gnawing at the certainty she had always relied on to navigate her work. By evening, the airline issued a public statement. It was polished and conciliatory, promising a commitment to fairness and a thorough examination of customer service protocols. The statement garnered mixed reactions. Some praised the airline for addressing the issue, while others dismissed it as empty corporate jargon. For Amari, the statement felt like a step in the right direction. But it wasn't enough. Change, she knew, wouldn't come from words alone. It would require action, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As the day drew to a close, she sat on her couch, scrolling through the messages of support she had received. Amid the noise, one thought kept surfacing. Maybe this time, the ripple she had created would grow into something larger. Outside, the city carried on as usual, indifferent, unbothered by the story unfolding in its midst. But for Amari, Evelyn, and countless others who had felt the weight of being unseen. The moment carried a quiet significance. It was a reminder that even the smallest voices, when heard, could begin to reshape the narrative. The terminal had grown quieter as the evening settled in, the rhythm of travelers ebbing and flowing like a tide. Evelyn Grace sat alone in the back office, her desk lamp casting a soft glow across a stack of employee manuals and corporate directives. The article that had gone viral the day before was still on her mind. Though she hadn't mentioned it to anyone, she had read it twice. Not because she needed to understand the details she had lived them, but because she couldn't shake the sense that the story held a mirror up to her own actions. It wasn't accusatory, and her name wasn't mentioned. Still, the descriptions of indifference, of quiet dismissal, clung to her. Her job had always been about rules. Follow the guidelines, meet the metrics, avoid unnecessary conflict. It was how she'd risen through the ranks. How she'd earned respect in a role that required balancing empathy with efficiency. But now, as she read through the airline's internal memos on customer service procedures, Evelyn couldn't help but notice how many gaps there were, spaces where discretion allowed bias, conscious or not, to creep in. The knock on her office door startled her. It was Daniel, the young agent who had voiced his doubts after Amari's case. He stepped in hesitantly, holding a small stack of documents. "Evening," he said, his tone cautious. "Got a minute?" Evelyn gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Daniel placed the documents on her desk. "It's about the report we're supposed to file on complaints like Ms. Dawson's. I've been looking through some of the older ones, cases where passengers felt like they weren't being treated fairly. There's a pattern." Evelyn felt a twinge of unease. "What kind of pattern?" Daniel hesitated, then opened the top file. "A lot of the complaints come from people of color. And in most of those cases, the resolution either takes longer or isn't as thorough. It's not written anywhere, obviously, but when you look at the data, it's hard to ignore." Evelyn's instinct was to push back, to remind him that every case was different, that delays were often the result of factors beyond their control. But the words caught in her throat. She had read the same reports. She had seen the discrepancies, though she had never let herself dwell on them. "I'm not saying it's intentional," Daniel added quickly. "I just think we should be aware of it. If we don't acknowledge it, nothing's going to change." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. Beyond it, the tarmac was bathed in soft yellow light, the silhouettes of planes waiting patiently for their next journey. She thought about Amari, about the look in her eyes when she had asked for the same level of assistance she'd seen others receive. "What do you want to do?" Evelyn asked finally, her voice quieter than she'd intended. "I think we need to bring it up," Daniel said. "To corporate. They're already under pressure from that article. Maybe now's the time to push for actual change." Evelyn considered his words, weighing the risks. Speaking up could jeopardize her position. She had built her career on her ability to navigate the rules without challenging them, to do her job without drawing unnecessary attention. But Daniel's earnestness reminded her of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of responsibility. Not just to the airline, but to the people they served. She nodded slowly. "Leave the files with me. I'll look through them tonight." Daniel's expression brightened slightly, though he didn't press her for more. He left the office quietly, leaving Evelyn alone with the stack of reports. As the hours passed, Evelyn read through case after case, each one painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. Complaints dismissed as minor inconveniences, apologies offered without action, patterns of treatment that, while subtle, spoke volumes about whose voices were deemed worth listening to. By the time she closed the final file, it was well past midnight. Evelyn sat in silence, the weight of the evidence settling heavily on her shoulders. She thought about the airline's statement, the promises of reform, the assurances that every passenger mattered equally. They were just words, as hollow as the assurances she had given Amari at the counter. Evelyn knew she had a choice. She could let the files gather dust, reassure herself that she had followed protocol, and continue as she always had. Or she could risk stepping outside the bounds of her role, confronting a system that thrived on quiet complicity. In the stillness of the office, she made her decision. The next morning, Evelyn sent an email to Michael Rhodes, attaching several of the reports she had reviewed. She kept her message brief, identifying herself only as a concerned employee who wanted to support his investigation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected, the possibility of change not just in the airline, but in herself. As she walked through the terminal that day, the world around her looked the same. Passengers rushed to their gates. Announcements echoed overhead, and the rhythm of the airport continued uninterrupted. But Evelyn carried a quiet hope that, beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. Weeks had passed since Amari's quiet confrontation at the airport, but the ripples of that moment continued to spread. The airline, under growing public and media scrutiny, announced a series of initiatives aimed at addressing concerns raised by passengers like her. The changes were modest but meaningful: mandatory training on implicit bias for all staff, updated protocols for handling complaints, and a new oversight committee to ensure accountability. For Amari, the news brought mixed feelings. On the one hand, it felt good to know her voice had contributed to something larger. On the other, she couldn't ignore the cost of speaking out, the emotional toll of fighting to be heard, the vulnerability of sharing her experience with the world. She sat on a park bench near her home, a book open on her lap but unread. The afternoon was quiet, the air crisp with the first hints of fall. Around her, children played on the swings, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a peaceful scene. Yet her thoughts kept circling back to the journey that had brought her here. The notification on her phone buzzed softly, pulling her attention back to the present. It was an email from Michael Rhodes. "Hi Amari. I thought you'd like to know the airline is moving forward with some of the changes we talked about. It's not everything, but it's a start. I also wanted to thank you again for trusting me with your story. People are paying attention now. Take care, Michael." Amari smiled faintly. Michael's work had helped amplify her voice, but it was the collective weight of so many shared experiences that had forced the airline to act. It wasn't just her story, it was a mosaic of countless others, stitched together into something too visible to ignore. Across the city, Evelyn Grace sat in her office, watching the news on her computer. A reporter was discussing the airline's reforms, praising the steps being taken while noting the long road ahead. Evelyn listened in silence, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. She had received no acknowledgement for the files she had sent to Michael. She hadn't expected any. Her decision to act had been a quiet one, born not of a need for recognition but of a growing awareness that doing nothing was no longer an option. Evelyn closed the browser and turned her gaze to the window. The runway stretched out before her, planes rising and landing with a steady rhythm. She had spent years watching this view, seeing each journey as a symbol of efficiency and order. Now, she saw something else, a reminder of the people behind every ticket. Each with their own story, their own struggles. She thought about Daniel, who had continued to push for change within their department, and about Amari, whose quiet insistence had sparked something neither of them had anticipated. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt a sense of purpose beyond the confines of her role. In the weeks that followed, she began approaching her work differently. She listened more, not just to what passengers said, but to what they didn't say, the hesitations, the unspoken frustrations. She encouraged her team to do the same, to look beyond the scripts and policies that had long governed their actions. It was a small shift, barely noticeable to those outside the office. But for Evelyn, it marked the beginning of something larger, a quiet rebellion against the complacency she had once mistaken for professionalism. For Amari, the fight was over, at least for now. She knew better than to believe that one article or a few policy changes could erase the deep-seated biases woven into the fabric of daily life. But she also knew that progress, however slow, was still progress. As she walked home from the park that evening, she allowed herself a rare moment of optimism. The road ahead was long, but she had seen what could happen when people refused to stay silent. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping victories, it was about the small, steady acts of courage that chipped away at injustice, one moment at a time. In the skies above, a plane traced a steady arc toward the horizon, its path illuminated by the fading light of the setting sun. It was a quiet, unremarkable scene, The kind most people wouldn't think twice about. But for Amari, Evelyn, and the countless others whose lives had intersected in that small airport, it carried a deeper meaning, a reminder that even the smallest ripples could reshape the surface of the water.